we're going to be operating today is that the chairing is going to be minimal. We really want to have lots of opportunity for conversation. So we have asked each of our speakers to limit their remarks to 15 minutes and chairs to be strict with enforcing that limitation. So that in each of the sessions, each of the panels, we have half of the time devoted to the presentations and half of the time devoted to the discussion and to the questions. That also means that in each of the panels, our introductions of the panelists will be as minimal as possible, just their names, but you have their bios in the program. So I'll leave it to you to check out who they are more fully. So in the first panel, we have 3 speakers in the order that you see them arrayed here before you. And so the first speaker will be Rashad Dinesh, and then I'll introduce in such a minimal fashion the other 2. Rashad.
Mind if I stand?
No, not at all, Greg, please.
Well, good morning, everyone, and so happy to see everyone gathered here today, and I hope many of you had the opportunity to be part of that fantastic evening last night. Such a wonderful beginning to this dialogue. As you can see from the program, my few remarks have an odd little title, which is trying to be cute, but it just says the genealogy of a symposium, which is, I'm actually going to tell the more truthful story of how this symposium came about than Jeremy's hyperbole and reflections earlier. And I thought that would just be helpful, just to set the scene. So I'm not going to present any coherent set of thoughts or remarks. I'll leave that for the much more distinguished and scholarly panelists than I. But this idea for this symposium was born just over a year ago, as many good things are around a dinner table. And it was an evening where John Burroughs, who's standing at the back, there's seats here if you want to come, John. John Burroughs, Deloria Bighorn, who you just heard from, Elder Robert George from the Cowichan tribes, and a few others of us who sort of, some people who work on the legal and policy side of issues of Indigenous justice, and gathered, and we're just having a free-flowing evening and discussion. And I thought I would just share some of the themes from that evening and how that sort of led to the discussions that Jeremy was talking about a few minutes ago. And, you know, as you would expect, some of that evening was sort of recounting and acknowledging some of the shifts that individuals had seen and experienced. I mean, in one way, you saw the evidence of it last night. You know, an overflow, massive crowd to hear and learn about Indigenous law and the role of the sacred. You also heard about it that night, Elder Robert George, who's one of the leaders of the village experience, which I don't know if some of you have gone through, but an immersive experience where populations of Canadians go through, including what the life is, the cultural life in the village life, and for some of the tribes and nations up the island, and the residential school experience, and immersing in that. I mean, the fact that we're in a place where such, I think Dr. Skip Dick said it last night, there's a lot of things happening that are long overdue, but, you know, is excitement at seeing them begin to unfold. That is something accelerating and changing, and we remarked on that. I think that evening John and I shared, I think maybe it was 12 or 13 years ago, we were both in different ways related to a project going on here in British Columbia with the First Nations Leadership Council, Grand Chief Stuart Phillip and Grand Chief Ed John and Sean Atleo at the time. And I remember sitting around the table with them, with John and with others, actually discussing, because this was a project that required some degree of public awareness. How would we get Canadians to even talk about reconciliation, aware of even the term, or aware of Indigenous rights? Well, that's not the space we're in now. right? We're in a different space. However, right, with that change, that dynamism, there's a lot of awkwardness and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of tensions around these shifts that are occurring, not just in the racism that we see expressing itself in some ways, in more bold ways than we've often seen, but also in learning how to talk and reflect on these matters. I mean, we have, like the term reconciliation itself, right, which is a term that I think we're all struggling to imbue with meaning and to consider whether it's appropriate in various contexts or ways, or what do we really mean by it. I mean, we have some great leaders here who are in that work, Robert Joseph, of trying to imbue a meaning into that term, but it has tensions around it. Of course, the roots of the term are biblical in origin and have to do with God and humanity's reconciling in Christ's atonement, right? Like, that's the roots of how we talk about it. Now we're using it in a very different way. But I think a lot of the tensions that we sometimes feel in how we talk about this is we often talk about it with some sort of assumption of a settled ontology or a settled architecture, that there's a settled reality and we're trying to learn to relate with each other, but not necessarily questioning what's underneath, not questioning the architecture of our society and our patterns of relations at their core. That implied in the term reconciliation is a new way of relating, but doesn't get enough to the issue of a complete reimagining of the foundations of how human beings learn to live together and the structures that they build and the architecture of our society as a whole. Right? That's the space that really requires a lot of examination and thought. And are we being as bold and as audacious enough as is required? I remember many, many years ago, and I apologize for you that have heard me tell this story before, but I think it captures some of the complexities of trying to imbue meaning into this work and to this struggle for social change and justice. And it's a story when one of the great philosophers, English, Cambridge, Oxford philosophers, I'm not going to name them, of justice, one of the great liberal thinkers of the 20th century, visited a class I was teaching in Iqaluit to a group of law students. This is at the Kitsarak Law School. How long ago?
2001 to 2005.
Long time ago. 2001. Long time ago, and with 13 law students, and he happened to be there, Inuit law students, of course, and he wanted to come present a paper to the students. And so he came and presented a paper, and he spoke about basically, I'm not being mean and a little trite, but basically the gist of the paper was, now that there's a land claims agreement, and now that you have your own legislative structures under the land claims agreement, haven't we really resolved the issues of history and the future and the structures we need? So he spoke for about 45 minutes and presented that. And then I saw the students, sort of looking at each other when he was done and self-identifying, and it was clear they were figuring out who was going to respond. And then the elder in the class got up, and this is what she said, and I'm just an observer to this, but she said, I have 5 generations living inside. My grandmother, who lived on the land and never saw a southerner, the term used there for every other person on the group of people on the planet. My mother, who was taken off the land and had to live in a settlement. Me, who was put in residential school. My children, who were teenagers at the time, they babysat my kids. My teenagers, who play video games and watch TV and know very little of what it means to be Inuit. And my unborn grandchildren, who will know nothing of the life of my grandmother. Right? In that exchange, if we can call it an exchange, I'm not sure it was the deliberative reasoning actions that John talked about last night, but in that exchange, I think we see the complexities, the depth, the need for a new language and a new conceptualization of how human groups are going to live together and structure, of the vastly different experiences that have to be grappled with to envision and structure what this future looks like, of how we use terms. I mean, I think it says it in the program when we talk of reconciliation or any of these, where are we placing the burdens and on whom of what must be done, right? Who is being challenged to act and how, right? Who must listen and learn and change, right? All of these factors came up. So back to the evening, you know, out of that discussion around the dinner table came a whole set of themes around, I think, the notion that we have a fairly intense political, economic, social, cultural discourses around this struggle for justice and social change. Oh, I should say legal, sorry for all the lawyers in the room, legal discourses, sorry, my apologies. But legal discourses as well. But then there were a whole set of themes that we thought could touch on the issue of the spiritual, using a term. One of them, of course, was last night. And do we have the title up? No, the role of the sacred. Really getting to the issue of the need for not just the relationship between Indigenous law and what might be called the spiritual dimensions of the legal, but really the Indigenous cosmologies and spiritualities coming to the fore and influencing and shaping how much of this work and dialogue takes place. So that was one, and John and Val beautifully brought that, and I'm sure many of our speakers are going to go in depth in various aspects of that today. But a second aspect that we touched on is that there's a real deficiency of will that we experience as a society in trying to grapple with this arena of work and justice. There is an increasing amount of practical knowledge about some of these challenges and our histories and our tensions. And there's an increasingly amount of motivation and good intention. But we struggle as a society to take the transformative actions that are needed. And the question is, why is that? Right? I mean, we can tell narratives about, you know, hundreds of court cases that don't get applied. We can talk about all sorts of arenas where that deficiency of will exists. And one of the issues in thinking about the deficiencies of will is that there is a tendency, I'm not talking about the sophisticated people in this room, but there is a tendency to often speak about this work in very instrumental terms. We need to do it because it'll help the economy. We need to do it because it'll make people more comfortable that their fee simple title's not in trouble. We need to do it because it'll help the environment. Yes, all of that may be true. But there's, I think, a need, and I think this goes, in my mind, to what John and Val were talking about last night at one level, to learn to speak and think about this in intrinsic terms as well, as an intrinsic good, as having an intrinsic value. John last night, I remember he said the strength of the earth, right, is seen in the plant, whether it was strawberry, the plant, or both, the strength of the earth, right? And as I was sitting there last night, this reminded me of something from my own tradition, which is the idea, the teaching, which is from another part of the world altogether, that everything in existence has its state of perfection. Or another term is that everything in existence has a state of paradise, is another term for it. And our duty, our responsibility, our main purpose in life is to help everything in existence reach and then express and meet that potential of that state of paradise. And, you know, there's a statement that came to me when John was talking last night about the strength of the earth is in plants, and I found, I don't know, I saw a similarity. This is the statement. It says, Nothing is more beloved, nothing, than to keep water in a state of the utmost purity. To such an extent that if one should come aware that the cup of water one holdeth had passed through any impure part of the earth, one would be deeply grieved and saddened. Right? To me, it's expressing a very similar conception, right? The strength of the earth is in the plant. It's like the state of paradise of the earth is in the flowers and the beauty and the life-sustaining qualities that it has. And here, the impure part of the earth, right, that then becomes the rationale that all rivers, streams, and lakes must be pure and clean. 2 minutes. I'm almost done. My point here is, though, when we think in those terms, it leads us then to be thinking about the dynamics of how do you bring out and support the intrinsic value of something. It's through love. It's through truthfulness. It's through caring. It's through humility. It's through many of those values that we talked about last night and heard about last night, right? It's not for some other reason. It's because those are essential to the purpose and potential of that thing coming to fruition, and we have a duty and responsibility to those. That is, in my mind, where I think part of our deficiency of will lies, in our inability to really see the value, to see this work as a choice rather than a necessity and an imperative, because of the future of the patterns of relations we need to create. Now, my last episode, which I can't get into from that night that we shared about, and again it was raised last night, was simply we talked about how the realities of colonialism is the imposition of everything from a cosmology to a constitution, to use the language. It's every aspect of knowledge of our emotions and actions and our will and how we're to behave and the structures. Colonialism attempts to impose all of those on a group of people, and on the rest of society who's going to privilege and benefit from that position. Colonialism at the same time insists that those others commit to that colonial cosmology. So it's an imposition and an assistance. Now, the reason I'm raising this, and I have to end, and my apologies to my co-speakers, is that co-panelists, is that to reconciliation, to grapple with it, demands that we similarly go from cosmology to constitution. That there has to be coherence, upending of the very foundations of how we ordered our life, because all of them are shaped and influenced by that the cosmology to constitution that has infiltrated all aspects of lives, Indigenous and non, that we don't fully see. I'm over my time. I apologize. I hope you have a wonderful day.
And now I'd like to call upon André Loisel of Osgoode Hall Law School at York University in Toronto.
Thank you. No, this needs to be pretty close. I lost my voice just in time for this conference. I'm glad to be sandwiched between two good voices today, so we will end with Pierrot, who speaks, whose sound is going to be much more harmonious. I'm really honored to be here and to be a part of this gathering. And I really look forward to the ideas and the paths of action that are going to emerge from our exploration together today. The particular question that I think we've been asked to speak to on this panel this morning has to do with starting to flesh out a little bit how different spiritual traditions help us understand the work of reconciliation. And in particular, what do Indigenous spiritual practices teach us about modes of thinking and relating respectfully to oneself and to each other and to the world. And how does that translate into the intercultural and intersocietal work of reconciliation, of decolonization? I want to say a word about the place I speak from to contribute to this conversation. I'm a Québécoise. I'm a non-Indigenous legal scholar. My mother is Egyptian of Coptic origin, and my dad is part Irish, part French from a bit more long-standing immigration, a couple of generations earlier than my mom, who came as a young adult to Quebec. I'm from Montreal. My research has been, over the last decade, my doctoral research, which I conducted here at UVic and recently defended in the Faculty of Law, is rooted in relationships within Stalo communities, within the Fraser Valley, which is part of the larger Coast Salish world that we are here gathered on. And my way of receiving Stalo teachings has been informed, among other things, by my training in the civil and common law traditions, and by the way those Euro-Canadian legal traditions have shaped the world that I was raised in, and my sense of self and agency in it. It's also informed at the root and prior to any legal training at all, of course, by my family relationships and my family experience. To me, what being connected to other people and to the world comes from is rooted in that experience of family and of love in it. Also, my understanding of loss and of addiction comes from close family ties. And the ability to be and the incapacity to be present in a meaningful way for somebody who's the closest person to me in the world. The closest people to me in the world also comes from that experience. The spiritual and religious tradition that I was brought up in as a Christian and a Catholic in Quebec is also relevant. And so those are all of, or a brief outline of some of the references that I work with and that I came with when I started to work about a decade ago with Stalo communities. They are both the references that enable my work and my relationships, and that also constrain and limit my understanding of what is shared with me. And that I work to peel back and to understand better as I learn from the references that have been also transformed by contact with Stalo and Coast Salish friends, as they are with friends from a lot of other legal, political, philosophical, and spiritual traditions. So in light of my state of voice today, what I plan to do is just to outline some of the things I've learned by working with Stalo communities toward the work I've been doing with them was toward forming a sense of how their own internal legal order works and what their own legal sensibility consists in. So to get started on this, I would say that one of the most important things I've learned is that Stalo legal sensibility is deeply and pervasively informed and animated by a spiritual sensibility. So what does that consist in? as far as I've received it and processed it and been a witness to it, that spiritual sensibility is the sense that everything is connected. The sense also that there are really powerful forces that make the world what it is, and that act on things and through things, including on us and through us as humans. The sense, too, that those forces can be so powerful, including our own, those that act through us, they can be so powerful that it would be foolish to think that we can control them. But the very important sense as well in Stalo and Coast legal spirituality, again as I understand and receive it, that the absence of control does not mean the absence of responsibility. A really important dimension of Stalo law and spirituality, as I see it, stems from that principle that we as humans have a responsibility to relate to the forces that are beyond our control. That we can learn to inflect our own power in ways that are constructive or destructive. So the purpose and the wisdom of Stalo spiritual resources and practices is geared toward helping Stalo Huelmoch people learn just how to do that and to help them keep attending to that work throughout their lives. So the domain, if you will, of Huelmoch spirituality is inherently that of transformation. The domain and set of practices that attend to the perpetual transformation of who they are, of who we as humans are, and how we are in relation to the forces we do not control, including individually our own power. So you can hear that there's a really important relationality at play here. And one of the ways in which, in the Huelmoch legal and spiritual tradition, in which those traditions give shape to that relationality, is by fleshing out a set of practices that have to do with witnessing. Again, an inherently relational practice. So I want to say just a few words about witnessing and what I've been learning and thinking and receiving, reflecting in my own life about that practice. There's a lot of places where I see witnessing at work in giving shape to Stalo legal and spiritual tradition. And modes of relating, modes of reasoning, modes of thinking, in the context of longhouse governance work. So really legal political work that takes place in the longhouse. The role of witnesses is formal and it's explicit. People are called to witness the work that's going to take place in the longhouse. It's central to the carrying out of governance. But even the person that usually is standing in the middle of the floor of the longhouse, the speaker, and I know there's quite a few Huelmoch speakers in this house. Even the speaker, I would suggest, in his own way, needs to adopt a witnessing stance in the spiritual sense. Because it's his role, as I understand it, to perceive the power that's in the room as people come in, the people, the power that they bring with them, and the way in which all of the people who are going to gather for a given governance occasion relate to each other in that moment. And the speaker's role is to perceive that. So it's a role that has to do with spiritual attunement in a really important way. He needs to be a witness to that power at the spiritual level, and to shape his speech, to shape his way of speaking at the gathering, so as to bring everyone together, so that everyone together will contribute positively to the transformation in the roles and responsibilities and identities of the family members who are calling the gathering, who are putting on the ceremony. So I think from seeing the title of my friend Sarah, who's going to speak this afternoon, that you'll hear more about that in the governance context, among others. What I've come to see is also that witnessing is a really important stance or ethos in the context of purely spiritual practice as well, in the Stalo and Coast Salish context, the context of winter dance practice, which in the Fraser Valley has had a major role in Stalo resurgence after the ban on the potlatch was lifted in the 50s, and in the revitalization of their political and legal tradition since then. In other words, it's the resurgence of the winter dance practice that I think to a large degree, at least in that part of Coast Salish territory, has led the way to the ongoing decolonization of Stalo society, its recovery of itself and of its power. The intimate process of becoming a dancer is not something I can or should ever try to speak to. It's very intimate work. And the specific teachings that guide a person through that process are meant for the initiates themselves. But from attending winter dance ceremonies and from my relationships within families whose lives have been deeply transformed by the practice, and also from reflecting on events and relationships in my own life and in the life of my family, a reflection that is a personal reflection that is part of spiritual practice, as I've come to be taught by Hualmuch friends. I can share what I understand of the elements, some basic elements of meaning and structure of the practice as they relate to witnessing. Maybe I should ask how many minutes are left.
2.
Okay, so maybe not that much. What I'll just say in very general terms is that what often leads someone in the Stalo context to become a dancer is a sense of disconnectedness, which leads to suffering and to a range of destructive behaviors often. And the initiation process into the dance leads the person to transform that suffering into medicine instead of destruction. During that process, a person is said to reconnect with their spirit, with the intimate source of their lives, of their life force. And he or she is helped by the longhouse workers to see their own spirit. And so they are called to witness who they are by people doing this work of active witnessing with them. And that's the heart of the ceremony after the initiation. If you ever go to a winter dance gathering, that's what you will see reenacted there, is a cry that's transformed into song And the medicine of that song, of the dance, of the paint, of the regalia that composes spiritual identity on an individual basis is what is shared with the community, witnessing and accompanying the individual in doing so. I want to say something about reconciliation. So just before I do so, I need to say that becoming a dancer is a process of empowerment that I think of as deeply tied to finding one's own place in a web of meaningful relationships that are spiritual and social. If those ties do not already hold deep significance for the struggling person, the person who's going to become a dancer, showing them how to reinscribe those ties with meaning is not likely to be an adequate prescription, even if the person is indeed presenting the signs of destructiveness and strandedness associated with spirit sickness. So you need to want to find your place within your Hualmoch community in order to become a dancer. So the few words about reconciliation I want to say about this are that if I think of reconciliation on that model that I just briefly outlined of witnessing and of the spiritual sensibility of Stalo people, I think that the struggling person is Canadian society. I think that Canadian society needs to, like the person who wants to become a dancer, Canadian society needs to understand and to want to find a legitimate place in relation to its broader community, to the community of hosts who have welcomed it and allowed it to become who it is in this land. And just like the process of initiation into the winter dance, I also think that reconciliation, it would benefit to be understood as a process of rebirth. The new dancers are called babies because they are reborn to themselves. And that full first winter of being babies and of then being 1 and 2 and 3 in their reconnectedness with their spiritual selves, there's a really strong understanding that they are starting from scratch again. And I think that's how reconciliation for Canadian society is a spiritual challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre. I'd now like to call upon Pierrot Tremblay of Laurentian University in Sudbury. Pierrot.
Thank you, Jeremy. Kwe nin piano kachur. I'm Pierre Esipionut from the Shell River. Inu from the people from the Shell. It's slow, huh? You hear me better now? Oh, sorry. Sorry. So I'm Inu from the East Coast. We're about 20,000 people, brothers and sisters of the EU and the other Algonquin family. So not only we're colonized by Canada, but also by Quebec. So we're forced to speak French and prohibited from speaking English, so that's why my English is so rough. So my apologies if I say, if I'm impolite or something, that's not my intention. So I will do my best. No, seriously, I'm very honored to be here today. Thank you to Jeremy, to everybody that organized, Catherine too, for the helping with the trip. It's always an honor to be back in Victoria and to be related to what is now called the School of Victoria, this new way of seeing things and being recognized in the world. It's amazing to be all the work that is doing. So thank you very much. And it was beautiful yesterday to hear John and Val and to see everybody so happy and of the new initiative. So congratulations also for the PhD. It's something to speak after noble souls like Russian and Andre. I'm very pleased. So I will speak today about my research. You know, I've been investigating for 20 years my own community relation to the past, my family, my community Esipit, and the research itself, and then the process that led me, what I've experienced through this process of research on cultural oblivion, what the community and our family desire to forget, and all the dams that intercede with our relation with the past and prevent us from going upstream to recover the story of our birth somehow. And what I tell my students, and watch out, don't reproduce this at home, it can be very dangerous. Both dangerous and very instructive, but when we start to be interested in what everybody wants to forget, then we face some serious issue. And the dams are not always the one we believe. And so on one side there's traumatic forgetting, with things that we forget automatically because we're wounded, especially when we're young. And then there's what I call social forgetting, things that we're kind of forced to forget, you know, that we're ashamed of, that we hide, that we don't want to show, and from the command to forget. And we know our story, and at the Regional School was one of this force that was erasing our memories and relation to the past. But my interest is mainly in subjective, what I call subjective amnesia or subjective oblivion, what we choose to forget. This agency, this act of unvalidating somehow an important part of our inventory of experience. And also this idea that we can forget, in my view, is somehow is wrong, but it's at the foundation of the Americas, of the colonization of the Americas, that the whole world will fall, will disappear, and then a new society will be built. And and as John said yesterday, reconciliation has a lot to do with the land, with reconnecting with the land, and as Val exposed to it. It has to be related to our internal issues. So I've been looking at discontinuity, disconnection, our rupture, and everything that distances us from our cultural memory, from our own knowledge, and why we are apart, and why there was so much distance that was created between us. And I think the case, the condition of the Innu is a bit particular because we have been colonized for 400 years from the first contact in the early 17th century. So in my community in particular, the imaginary, the colonial imaginary have been absorbed to a very, very deep level. And I've studied both the external and internal determinant of oblivion, and which is translated in the form of advanced psychological colonialism. So it has profoundly modified the way we see ourselves, and the idea that we have of ourselves and also of our cultural knowledge. And I think what we have lost on our way somehow is what I call the cosmic gaze, or this vision that was exposed earlier about this philosophy of things being, everything's being related, this integral views on things. This idea, this advanced conception of freedom as feeding what feed us, as this philosophy of life as and oneness, and the treasure, in my view, at the bottom of our teachings and stories, and I think of the story of Chakapesh in Innu oral tradition, is this idea that we are a small species on a small planet, a small family at the end, and which has deep implication and ethical and practical implication. So those simplest truth and law arising from the water, that if the fish dies, human will die one day. Water is life. And also that this hurt is somehow a huge diamond that cannot be evaluated. Its value cannot be assessed, so it cannot be traded, it cannot be sold, it cannot be seen. And those are very deep in the teaching, and and thinking about reconciliation, it reminds me of beyond the antinomies and the contradiction, there's deep symbol that unify our minds as human. And if I think in Innu oral tradition, in Innu stories, the sun is so important, the centrality of the sun, and how the prayer in honor, and the songs in honor of the sun are very important, as in the code of Hammurabi, which is one of the first written code of law, which was written in honor of Shamash, which is the sun god, if I can say. Huh? So the sun has a very powerful and deep metaphor and common sources, and that somehow we have to go back, each of us, to our own tradition and own philosophy to be able to have a real dialogue. And there are deep rupture and wounds in our own. So for somehow reconciliation is really with ourselves, and with this also cosmic gaze on things. And 400 years of colonization and being told that we are not here, that we don't exist. I think of the terra nullius, and then through 9124, what we call the Canadian apartheid, that we're object. So all this process is a process of somehow of desacralization, and this idea that we should master the land and we should trade it, and being exploited, it's okay, and all this this production of a certain idea of ourselves seems to be central. And in the case of the Innu, and in the context of also with Quebec nationalism, and the kind of another layer of hegemony, and then when we absorb this selective memory, it has profound effect. It had profound effect on us too. And also when we enter the academia, there's so much categories and theories and structure, and we are kind of constantly forced or to renounce to this gaze on things that is integral, that is complete. So we start at some point to see ourselves through the eyes of the others, and we start to absorb those beliefs. And so in the form of self-mutilation, I would say, and a reduction and self-prejudice. So I'm very interested in those self-prejudice, and the way we disregard ourselves, and I would say kind of epistemological invalidation. And at some point we stop to see things, or see I think of spirits, of dreams, the earth as a source of law. And we were diverted from what is at the heart of our spirituality. So we became invisible to ourselves. Kind of blindness to spirit, deafness to the voice of the land and dreams, and perception of our stories as invalid and childish. I know for people here, it's not necessarily the case, but on the field, in the community, especially in my community and many new communities, that's the case. People have those views often. Not everybody, but it's widespread. So the perception of our knowledge as invaluable, not as a valuable source of knowledge and of law. And this process of desacralization, for me, leads to a concept, a core product of colonialism, which is abandonment. The fact to abandon what is sacred for us, abandon of our lands, abandon of ourselves, abandon of the most vulnerable. So this idea that it has no value and will let it go, and a form of dehumanization also. So. And so this vision of the world, this philosophy, it's always too much to fit, including in the academia too. So there's also this form of academic colonialism too, and including in law faculties. And it's good to speak about it, to explore. Here, I know it's not the most colonized place, but it's not the case in all university, right? So, what seemed to be central, we have been trained, we have been conditioned to close our souls, to close our eyes, not to our source of law. And those representations became internalized. I remember a great hand who was telling me that we were told that before the reserve, we had no history. And for me, that's very important. It's a kind of metaphysic of domination, where before there was no story. And after years and years and years, it becomes internalized, and we start to believe this. And it leads to a form of internal tyrannies that are very powerful. And as cultural oblivion progress, anomia progress too, and then transgression, we lose direction, and then we go to the reef, and we do things that are opposite to what we believe is, to our own beliefs, and then there's the suffering that comes with it. And it results in very specific phenomena, and including the idea that we are nothing, that we don't exist, which I find fascinating among some youth who believe that we have no history. It was transmitted from generation to generation. But it's a production. This is the good news, and it can be undone. It can be changed. It can be transformed, those perceptions of ourselves. So one of the key concepts for me is that after 400 years of terra nullius, it resulted in the phenomenon that I call sui nullius, the idea that we don't exist, that we have no history and no law. And then mnemophobia, very phenomenon, which is a fear of the past, a promotion of forgetting, being away from stories, which is something that can be dangerous. Identity polysemy, I call it. Identifying indigenousness with the opposite of it, with the transgression. Being Inu means drinking, being violent, abusive. The idea of an inherent deficiency, a genetic weakness, which leads to a form of self-hatred. Very important phenomenon that our people are, what I call the kind of dirt that we have in ourselves. And another one is what I call psychological barbell, so that the reserve itself became internalized. And it leads to a form of incapacity. It's almost a reflex, a kind of barbell we have in ourselves, in our minds, which is the result of intergenerational trauma, which is a mix of disgust, nausea, fear, anxiety. This idea that if we reconnect with our stories, with our philosophy, with the land, we'll be contaminated. It's almost a reflex. So indigenization can be perceived as an ordeal, as a form of reassertion of regret and shame. And so this idea that there was an illness to cure was internalized by some of our people. I've also heard of mothers crying because their kids will learn Innu at schools through a revitalization project. Those are real things. And there's also the phenomenon in terms of power issues within communities that are often difficult to voice or to name, what I call internal tyrannies, where people who were deeply wounded took over power over time, and their desire to forget their own past because of tragedy in residential school, but also family issues and problem, became a desire to make everybody forget everything. And so when with the concentration of power comes the kind of projection of people in charge of their interiority on the whole community. So that was the discovery of my PhD research somehow. And I was very surprised because it's close family, it's people that are close to us often who have those wounds and that erase and rewrite according to their own, a chronology of their own action at some point. So what motivated me behind all this is teaching of elders who said we have to burst the abscess, we have to clean the house. And truth-telling for me, it's a way to release all this dirt that is between ourselves, that we have in our eyes, that we have in our hearts. No more time, huh? The little anecdote is that, and in the academia, we also have those ideas that when we say people laughing, saying, "Oh, they find laws in the skies, they find law in the clouds." I've heard those things, people laughing, and that our stories have no value. And what seems central to me is that people will perceive our stories and our tradition and philosophies at the height of their own views. So we have been reduced to be defined by the gaze of colonialism and colonialists. And so the work must be done a lot. There's a lot of work to do at home with ourselves, emptying the house, and I will go at the end right away. To make space, so the sources, the good spirits we can be inhabited again by those good spirits, and that's enough. Thank you.
So I feel like a really bad guy having to cut short the comments of such three noble souls. But you can redeem the situation through the questions that you ask and how you draw them out into further insights and further illumination. So we now have generous time for conversation, for questions. There are 2 microphones here, and if you don't mind, please do come to the microphones because that will allow us to pick it up on the tape, because there are some people who can't be here, as there were people who couldn't be here last night, and we will make the recording available afterwards. Which also is fair warning that if you'd rather not be recorded, then please ask your questions privately at one of the break times. So please, are there questions that people have, or comments, or reflections?
I'll break the ice.
Yes, please.
I don't even know what I'm going to say, but just to get started, I just want to say that you have given us so much, I don't know what to call it, meat for the brain and for the soul, that I would like, really, truly, I would like now to get together with a smaller group, and just be brief, because there is so much in what you have done that for me. I mean, it validates the whole conference. And so thank you very much. Thanks.
We have built the program so there are generous breaks. So I do hope that you'll get together in small groups as well. Please.
Hi, my name is Jane, and I'm a student here at UVic. I'm doing an undergrad, and one of my areas of focus is Indigenous health, which is why I'm here today. I knew nothing about Indigenous people before I started my degree part-time 3 years ago, and I still know almost nothing. But what I have learned is the interconnectedness, that absolutely everything is interconnected. And the interesting thing for me has been a bit of a revelation, really, that while that's true for Indigenous people, it's also true for non-Indigenous people, but we've forgotten. We've forgotten. And I was thinking about what you said, Pierre, about losing your soul. And, you know, there's a lot of religions in Canada. There's not a lot of soul. And I've learned for myself over the last 3 years that there's a whole lot more that we can learn from traditional, Indigenous, holistic living than the other way around. We ought not to have been teaching you, you ought to have been teaching us. So I thank you.
Tremblay. I'm just feeling very overwhelmed by your introspection, and I guess it just reminds me of why I'm here, because I'm struggling to understand the impact of my roots and, you know, my biases and my prejudices, and how I can enter into a just dialogue. So I thank you.
First year PhD student in political science here. Thank you all for the talks and all for the introductions and for the space for the event this morning as well. I had a question that's thinking about some of the recent events, and in light of the title of this panel as whose spirituality and which spirituality, some of the potential challenges that arise when the sort of dominant understanding of spirituality is something that's available for everybody, and then thinking about Indigenous spiritualities and how they are tied into other forms of Indigenous life that are not necessarily seen as available to the broader public, for very good reasons of a history of appropriation as well as repression. So I'm thinking, for example, about just to throw an example out there, Amanda Piel, the artist who was critiqued for appropriating the woodland style of art, and the sort of justification that because it's a spiritual style, she therefore has access to it. So I wonder if anyone has any reflections on that sort of, those kind of dynamics in thinking about spirituality and whose spirituality and which spirituality. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I'm fully qualified to reflect on this, but let me just share a few thoughts which may or may not connect. First, when listening to Pierrot speak about colonialism and desacralization, I think that's the term you used.
I tried.
You tried, beautifully. And connecting it to one of the points I rushed through at the end about when I started discussing sort of the cosmology to constitution and how colonialism both imposes and insists on others. I started reflecting as he was speaking that the desacralization that was imposed and forced through multiple avenues in his community and that he observed in his research, that desacralization in parallel was occurring in settler society and in European society. And we don't often, even though the rhetoric of a Christian mission or whatever was at the roots of some of the imposition and the effort to desacralize, we see an impact on the desacralization of the other populations. And then I was struck when you were speaking about academia, and I've had my own struggles with academia and some of the themes that you were talking about, is how in this society that we live in now, how space and discourse about imbuing the sacred or sacralization in academia in Canada will be led by Indigenous peoples or no one, given the dynamics that have taken place. Now, connecting that to the, I'm not sure how it connects to the appropriation issue. I'm in some ways, I'm intimately involved in the appropriation, some of the work that's going on around the discourses around appropriation, and I'm a little sensitive just about how to talk about them. But I would say on that we cannot understand the reality and depth and importance of the appropriation dialogue that's going on without fully situating and understanding what again Piero was talking about how the process of colonialism was at its heart imposing what many might say is the worst form of oppression there is, which is to construct a barrier between an individual and their own self, their own sense of their place in reality. And the appropriation issue, I mean, you have an appropriation debate we're having in this society while we live in a world where, you know, people are digitally cutting together anything from anywhere and layering it on each other, and it seems discordant. But it's not when you place it in the process that it is that part of that process of that spiritual oppression, for sake of a better term, being responded to and overcome. So I don't know, that's what came to mind from your question. I don't know if that's helpful.
There's a lot of promotion now with reconciliation, and we speak about Indigenous culture very positively, and it's normal that it leads to some obsession among the dominant society. You know, people they become Indian lovers, and you know, people become obsessed, and they become obsessed with it, and also the revival of Indigenous views and philosophies and. That were erased, that were supposed to disappear forever. So it creates a new foundation to evaluate the whole society and the whole civilization at some point. And it has huge effect and kind of erosion also the legitimacy of the dominant culture, and it fostered the collapse of master narrative, this idea, you know, that of superiority, and there are many things that are being questioned right now. So this revitalization or resacralization, you know, through stories, it's not without consequences. I'm more interested in the internal effect of it, the psychic effect of it. There's this story of Jimmy Durham. I find it, it's not really funny, but it tells a lot. You know, it's this guy who is called to have a role in a film. To play is someone from the First People, is an Indian, and he would play the role of a cowboy, you know. And his friends say, "Watch out, you know, you may kill yourself." I mean, it's a metaphor, but that's what we face at some point. If you're ready to renounce to who you are, then you can play the role. But so we live in a society that is overwhelmingly with dominated by some patterns and it doesn't change, some vision, ideologies, and views. So, for example, reasserting Innu Tipentimun, which is Innu ancestral sovereignty, the concept, and I see the effect right away when people reconnect with it and we start to embrace again this philosophy. It has an imperative of protection and guardianship on the land, and of resistance too, you know. So it has huge effect, huge practical consequences, you know. If we speak about Nipi Mantu, which is the spirit of the water, you know, and then we speak about pipeline. I mean, we can try to bridge the gap, but as a society, we have to make choices, and at some point, we have made our choices. We made our choice, you know, when you reconnect. But it can be unbearable to re-indigenize or reconnect with it because we're so overwhelming. So internally, it can be exhausting. It's very, very, very exhausting, and it can even be dangerous because we have the illusion that it can be just an illusion that Canada want to reconcile, that the state is, we have to believe in it and it will be nice. But there's a part of it which is a stratagem, you know? And if we think in terms of recognition and the reception of recognition in the community and the way elders will receive those new policies or new promises of reconciliation versus the younger people, or the recognition of rights. So what is the main determinant behind the reception of recognition as ontology, which is we will define our identity, or just as a strategy? I mean, it's really the connection with cultural memory and with the sense of our own philosophy. So for a youngster who has no idea already who he is and was not connected, this recognition becomes ontological. You recognize my right, you give me something, you know. So I exist. When for the one who know better themselves, they will know that it's a way to take something or to as a stratagem. So so we have to really watch out because the reassertion of our philosophies and the resacralization brings lots of antinomies. And if we don't want to create a reconciliation that would just erase those antinomies instead of dealing with it. So it's a lot about opening space as you do and listening deeply and speaking truly, honestly. And then we can have this kind of dense, recreate this dense link. I won't like what you say, but I know you're honest, so I can trust you.
Hello, Sarah Beam from the Department of History, and I want to thank all the speakers for what you brought with us this morning. For me, that theme of self-healing has really come out of this panel, and I found André Boisel's analogy that Canadian society is in a state of spiritual sickness, akin to someone approaching the winter dance to become a dancer. And so I guess I think for Canadian society, they have to figure out what their dance is. But I'm wondering if there's any Indigenous teachings, and I guess I'm asking people in the panel, but anyone else in the room, that could help. Like, how does someone come to realize that they're spiritually sick and that they need some kind of a process to heal? And I'm wondering if there are Indigenous teachings, things that people know of, that could help Canadian society recognize that they're in a state of spiritual sickness. That first step of sort of self-recognition that healing is needed. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you can offer.
There's maybe a couple of things I'd like to say. I was thinking about that because I was wondering about the limits of the analogy and what I could take from thinking about this from a winter dance perspective. And it also generated thoughts on the dynamic of appropriation that was just raised earlier that I have also kind of a salad of thoughts about. But I think there's a couple of different thoughts that come to mind. I think that a lot of segments. You know, when we talk about Canadian society, who are we talking about? What's the kind of, when we talk about Stalo society, who are we talking about, right? I'm at a point now where I say that I've received teachings from members of Stalo communities, right? Because I'm not, my work is not endorsed by Stalo society. And so anyway, with respect to Canadian society, I think there's lots of elements of Canadian society that are aware of the spirit sickness, that are fleshing it out each in their own way, that are thinking about what it means to have respectful relations. And they are also people who I think of, to again keep with the analogy of the winter dance, something I didn't talk about much is that in a lot of cases, it's not the person herself who's going to come to that recognition alone. There's going to be an intervention. And I think that Indigenous communities are proceeding to that intervention in a number of ways. I think Cindy Blackstock is proceeding to that intervention. I think that so many of the Indigenous voices we hear today well, they're not carrying out the full process, of course, but they are those voices that are flagging for us that something's been terribly wrong. The TRC is an intervention in that same sense, I think, and it's allowing us to at least a chance to come to that realization. But as I said earlier, if in the face of those messages and of those voices we're not prepared, the broader section of the powers that be, again, and of the dynamic of colonialism, which has set in motion things that are, to a degree, forces beyond any one person, any one institution's control, and that we need to reckon with as something we have a responsibility to be in relationship with. If we're not prepared to come together and to ask ourselves, what is, as non-Indigenous Canadians, what is our place in the circle? What is the place that only us can occupy? That's been the guiding light for me. One of my friends, Donis Kennedy, was speaking with me during my research at some point when I was thinking, really, like, I'm just learning so much, but I feel like I'm never going to be the one to talk about any of this. What's my role? And she, along with other teachers and elders within Homo society, said, well, you occupy a place that nobody else can occupy. That is yours. So you need to figure out what you can say with your own voice. That's what I've heard Murray Sinclair say as well, when inevitably after one of his talks somebody gets up to say, so what are we to do now? And now he just says, with varying degrees, I think, of exasperation, figure it out.
Kisokyokia, Bogakshik, Troy Hunter, a member of the Tanaka First Nation, and I'm raise my hands, give thanks to the First Nations whose traditional territory this is. Give thanks to the University of Victoria for bringing this on. The questions of great importance we're talking about today, and so I would just want to say a few words. Around 1994, I attended an ACES conference in Spokane, and I heard elders speaking to students there, Indigenous students in science and engineering. The elders said, we got together and we talked about our teachings. One of them was, we move towards like that which we think about. Maybe you are familiar with The Secret, the movie The Secret. The same thing. We move towards like that which we think about. It's what the elders told us. And today, we have a Truth and Reconciliation. This little book here is all of the recommendations that came out. And so the question is, how can we achieve reconciliation? Well, we move towards like that which we think about. It means that now we have something to think about. Now we have an Indigenous laws degree. And now we have funds in a budget from the provincial government. We have the federal government committed. We're talking about things like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples being implemented when at a time we had lost what we used to have. We had taken away our right to Sundance, our right to potlatch, our right to hire lawyers. Our lands were taken away. But how does that fit in with what we're talking about today, the sacred, the relationship? We have in this country a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That was put in place in 1982. Voices of Canadians. We had the train express of First Nations people all across Canada come to say, well, we want to be a part of this, we can't be forgotten. So our rights were enshrined in Section 35, and there's other parts in there. There's one thing that never gets talked about in the Charter, and that it's it's in the first part. Under the authority of God is kind of what it says. I can't remember the word. But that's sort of like the mandate. We're supposed to think about that. When we talk about God, when we talk about sacred, we're talking about our spirituality. We have many ways to pray. There is more than one religion in this world. But this is what has caused the problems that we are facing today. And how do we reconcile that? That's the question we have to deal with. How do we live together? We had Chief Justice Lemaire say in 1997, I believe it was, we're all here to stay. That was the last words in the Delgamuukw decision. We're all here to stay. Nobody's going anywhere. We're not kicking you off the land and you're not killing us as natives. So we have to work this out together. We have some questions that came up. There's, getting back to the ACES conference, what was taught to me was the 4 laws to creating change, or not the 4 laws, but in order to create change, there are 4 things that need to happen. And this, the first one is that it must come from within. And then I think that that's where we're grappling at is, the question was, how do we recognize that we're spiritually sick? That is an individual thing that must happen. Each and every one of us individually needs to look and to see, is this right? How can I do something? So change must come from within. Once you've decided that, we can have number 2. It must be preceded by a vision. Well, we have a vision, Truth and Reconciliation. This panel, what they're talking about, this university is a vision, and this building in this room is also a vision. So we're moving towards like that which we think about. Number 3, a great learning must take place. If we don't have that, then we just keep going back. And the 4th one is that in order for change to occur, you must have a healing forest. This university is a healing forest. All of you are part of that healing forest. It's that support that's needed. You can take a sick tree, you can take a sick forest, and you can nurture that tree and get it to grow again. But if you return it to that sick forest, it's going to get sick again. So what we need are support systems, an Indigenous law degree that supports that. Because what's going to happen, what needs to happen, is reconciliation that takes all of us together. And how do we live together? For we're all here to stay. And what we need is some new legislation. Because when we leave it up to judges to decide what's right, the common law, we have decisions that my nation doesn't agree with, the Tunaqa First Nation. They took to the Supreme Court of Canada the question of, we cannot develop this land, this mountain. It's sacred. And the developer wanted to build a ski resort. I skied 2 times on that mountain. I traveled there with my people, and I saw firsthand what makes it sacred. I've seen things. And that changed my mind, because I used to support it and say, we need economic development and we need jobs, but we have to put the sacred first. When we're told, when a creator gives somebody a vision, you do it. You know, Moses changed the world. He was given a vision. He was given commandments. Go out and change the world. When our people are given commandments through vision quest, dreams or whatnot, we're supposed to do those things. Any other way is not good. And when we make commitments to the Creator, it's the same. So, I just wanted to end on the one point, is that now I lost my train of thought.
Well, you've given us many things
Thank you.
to continue on along that train. And we are at time for the break, and perhaps what we can do is we can continue the reflections that you opened up for us. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. This has been a gift. So if we can assemble promptly at 11 o'clock for the next panel, that would be wonderful. Thank you.